The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, an Asian NATO, Pipedream or Future Security Network. In recent years, the concept of an Asian NATO has emerged as security threats escalate throughout the region. The goal of such an alliance would be for Asian nations to forge collective defense mechanisms against shared challenges, including rising tensions in the South China Sea, cyber warfare and terrorism. But how viable is a regional security alliance in Asia, given the continent's diverse political systems and geopolitical dynamics? Which nations are likely to oppose or welcome it? What role might the US play? And what are the potential advantages of an Asian NATO? To learn more about this timely topic, please join our live debate, bringing your questions and comments for our panel of experts.
Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for this Democracy Forum debate, where we examine closely issues of the day, often ones that are overlooked by mainstream media and commentary. This one perhaps not, because today's debate, an Asian NATO pipe dream or future security network, ? There's much talk about a new Cold War, the authoritarian axis, the rise of China, and that spectre that haunts much of the Indo-Pacific about the need or the calling to choose between two sides. A European and North American security pact in NATO is seen to have worked well for Western democracies, anchored in, for want of a better context, democratic cultures. But could or should it be attempted for a swathe of nations with no shared values, no shared religion, ethnicity, or culture? For our debate, we have a superb team of experts who breathe, talk, and think through these challenges of Asian security every day. Ambassador Desra Parkaya, John Hemmings, Chietigi Bajpai, Giri Rajendran, and Shihoko Goto. But before we begin, I'm going to ask Lord Charles Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum, to lay out the background and the canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
At the annual meeting of NATO members and their guests at The Hague last week, there were some noticeable absentees whose decision not to attend may question the ambition to develop a similar security network in the Asia-Pacific region. It was particularly significant that 3 of the IP4 members chose to stay away: Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Indeed, the response of key nation states to the role and purpose of a collective security pact will be essential in determining the application of a NATO-style alliance. And I'm very grateful to the Forum for convening this webinar at such a critical time to discuss these issues. Our panelists have been invited for their expertise in this rapidly evolving area of strategic studies. And I look forward with great interest to their individual contributions and to the panel discussion to follow under the moderation of Humphrey Hawksley. Writing for the journal Foreign Affairs this month, Ely Ratner, a former Assistant Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, believes that in the Asian Pacific region, I quote, a collective self-defense pact is now within reach. And he cited 3 trends to support this view. First, the advancing threat from China has prompted a new strategic alignment. Second, there is growing evidence of increasing security cooperation among United States allies. And third, the emphasis by the Trump administration on reciprocity is encouraging its Asian partners to consider a larger role in keeping the peace. It's interesting, however, that this view is facing criticism, not because it exaggerates the threat posed by China, but because it misjudges the role which the United States is likely to play in a defense pact. A paper published by the Lowy Institute last month entitled "The Wrong Time for a Collective Security Pact in Asia" suggests that, I quote, rather than reinforcing dependence on an increasingly unreliable United States, regional partners should focus on arrangements that provide strategic alternatives. these arrangements should be used to hedge against rather than reinforce reliance on the United States. Indeed, concern about the reliability of the US to act as a strategic counterweight to underpin the formation of a defensive alliance in the Asia-Pacific region appears to be growing. Addressing the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on East Asia and the Pacific early this month, the Brookings Institution analyst Lin Kuok referred to the impact of the Liberation Day tariffs and observed that, I quote, as Beijing holds itself out as a champion of free trade, while Washington swings a wrecking ball at the global trading system, Southeast Asia's economic ties with China are likely to deepen. And she warned, over time, strategic alignment could follow, either by design or necessity. And as the Lowy Institute concludes, I quote, the success of existing Asian security architecture has rested on bilateral flexibility, allowing individual nations to balance competing interests and maintain strategic autonomy. Forcing allies into premature clarity through a collective defense pact, paradoxically, could increase rather than decrease tensions. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar today. And if you have any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chat.
Lord Charles Bruce, thank you very much. Collective Self-Defense Pact now within reach, or strategic realignment, thinking of new roles because of the Trump administration. First, I would like to go to Dr. Desra Parkaya, ambassador to London for Indonesia, that vast Southeast Asian archipelago that sits in a way at the heart of this debate. His career is steeped in this topic, ambassador to the United Nations, chair of the UN's Committee on Disarmament and International Security, and back at home he served as Director for International Security and Disarmament. So, Desra Parkaya, an Asian NATO, a pipe dream or future security network, give us your view.
Well, thank you very much, Humphrey, for inviting me. Thank you, the Democracy Forum. It's an honor to be on the stage with distinguished speakers. Thanks, Lord Bruce, for setting the tone of our discussion. Allow me to answer this question into 4 short points. First, independent and non-aligned foreign policy of Indonesia. Indonesia's foreign policy is and will always be anchored in the principle of Bebas-Aktif, or independent and active, rejecting alignment with any military bloc or great power rivalry. An ASEAN NATO would run counter to the spirit of regional inclusivity and Indonesia's commitment to maintaining strategic autonomy. 2, Asia's diversity and complexity. Unlike post-World War II, Asia is not unified by a shared threat perception or historical security architecture. The region's geopolitical diversity and differing national interests make a NATO-style alliance difficult to conceive, let alone operationalize. 3, ASEAN-led security architecture. Indonesia believes in strengthening ASEAN-centric mechanism. We always call it ASEAN in the driving seat, such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM Plus Defense, and the East Asia Summit, which promote dialogue, confidence building, and peaceful conflict resolution. The priority should be enhancing cooperative security, not collective defense. This has been formulated in the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific strategy, which Indonesia plays a very important role, In this context, in this concept, it promotes the principle of inclusivity, the rule of law, and cooperation, while seeking to engage with all external powers, including major global powers. 4. Risk of escalation and division. Creating a military alliance in Asia could deepen divides, provoke distrust, and escalate tensions, especially amid rising US-China competition, including in our region. That's why Asia needs more diplomacy, not militarization. In conclusion, 2 points. The question again, a future reality or only through inclusive security? 1. Cooperative, multilateral, and inclusive security framework respecting international law and sovereignty offers a more sustainable path for regional peace. 2. The Asian NATO idea may remain a pipe dream unless reimagined through dialogue, trust, and multilateralism, not exclusion and deterrence. Thank you.
That was a fascinating and conclusive, in a way. A couple of points. You mentioned cooperative security, not collective defense. Define those for us. What's the difference?
Of course, whenever there's collective defense, then you are entering into some kind of treaty or agreement into defense. While cooperative cooperation, I think we are doing it through the dialogue. For example, ASEAN Defense Minister Dialogue. I think this is one of the clear example of how we can work, cooperate, not necessarily establishing military alliance or pact.
And we have a question from the audience that touches on an earlier point you made from Rutu Madan. What could an Asian NATO do that ASEAN cannot?
What Asian NATO can and ASEAN cannot? Is that the question?
Yes, yes. So this is imagining that there is an Asian NATO, whatever form that might take, we don't know. But what ASEAN is, I mean, the exact thing is, what could an Asian NATO do that ASEAN cannot do? So could ASEAN take the place of how we see NATO in Europe?
Well, to be honest, it is very difficult even now to imagine that ASEAN would transform itself into a NATO military alliance. For example, even the discussion among member states to establish peacekeeping operation as an ASEAN exercise, it has its own difficulties and dynamics. So I think do not go too far of imagining that ASEAN will transfer itself into military alliance. To be honest, it is so far away.
Thank you for that. And just finally, before we move on to Dr. John Hemmings, who's going to give a view from Hawaii and elsewhere, is that you talk about strategic autonomy. India also has a similar policy there. This is two big players in the Indo-Pacific region. How many would you say, or what proportion of the Indo-Pacific is aligned in some way, and what proportion has got what we can call strategic autonomy?
Let's be honest. When you talk about India's concept, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and even US, let's talk about and be honest, the big elephant in the room. They are containing China, as simple as that. But for ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific strategy, everyone will come, let's work together, and we are not going to decide whether we are pro the US or pro China. No, there has to be cooperation for us all.
And would there could you imagine a time that you would have to decide and not be strategically autonomous, as in the Cold War, for example, or have those days passed?
It is very difficult now if you look at the current situation, because the international community is preoccupied with so many things in the world, in many regions, and also one of the major power is also busy doing its own business.
Thank you very much. Please stay with us whilst we go to our next panelist, Dr. John Hemmings, Deputy Director of the Council on Geostrategy, and recently returned from the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. That's the US Department of Defense Regional Center in Hawaii. His research focuses on security and defense, and in a recent piece for the Pacific Forum, he underlines first how, despite Russia and the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific is America's priority region, and second, whether Britain and European governments should get involved, or should they concentrate their capacity closer to homes? John Hemmings, give us your thoughts. And firstly, do you agree with the Indonesian ambassador?
Yes, and by the way, I'll just say, even, I just finished working for Department of Defense Regional Center, so I don't represent US government position at all, just speaking in my own 2 cents. I agree the spirit of regional inclusivity, would be at odds with a NATO-like organization. We have to remember that NATO is a very specific type of very highly institutionalized alliance group. It came out of a special period in history when the Soviet threat to Europe was very clear and very strong amongst member states, and they were willing to give away that sovereignty in order to get that protection. And it has been quite successful. No NATO state, the exception of the United States, and that was from Al-Qaeda, a non-state actor, but no state inside NATO has been attacked in the history of NATO. And so it's in many ways, it's contrary to European historical experience. It's been a great success. Is it an issue now? We just saw the NATO summit with Donald Trump pushing people to pay more. Yes, of course it is. But I don't think that highly institutionalized structure is maybe appropriate for Asia. And I agree with the ambassador's remarks that maybe there's not a common threat perception. An alliance can be something as loose as 3 or 4 countries saying that if any of them are attacked, they will defend each other. Doesn't mean they need a secretariat and a military coordination at the level of a NATO structure. But they would need to defer some of their sovereignty in order to have that collective defense. The thing I would argue, just one slight little pushback on the ambassador's remarks, which broadly I'm very sympathetic to, is that this would be unimaginable or unhelpful to the spirit of regional inclusivity. And my sense is that history doesn't care. Great powers are going to be great powers, and non-aligned states were attacked all the time during the Cold War, and they eventually had to take sides. Geopolitics is a reality that mid-sized and small-sized states must be weary of. And that although I sympathize deeply with the personal perspective that he laid out, that I've heard often from ASEAN countries, that they wish to avoid it, if the geography is strategic, states should be weary of being isolated. And it doesn't have to be a US-led organization, it can be regional organization, as long as there's some willingness to be open-minded that if your maritime sovereignty is threatened by a regional power, as it is for many people in ASEAN, ASEAN is not going to be there for you if it's attacked. And so that's why we're having this conversation. So I would say keep an open mind and be willing to, cooperate militarily in ways that defend your interests over the long run. And I'll stop there and let you carry on the great moderation, Humphrey.
Set one thing in perspective there. Threat perception, you've spent the recent years in Hawaii, which is the center of that whole thing for the American military, basically. Is it seen as a threat place, or is the US, in your view, or sort of strands, over-egging the rise of China?
I think I've seen a bit of both, but gradually, if you look at both sides of the US debate on the Democrat and the Republican side, you'll see the long-term strategy of displacing the United States. It may not be an aggressive attack. It may not be an invasion of Taiwan. It could be a very slow-going strategy. But broadly, that's agreed upon. I mean, the one thing I will say, Humphrey, that's interesting for all on the call is states don't always perceive threats correctly. And so we think that at some point we'll all agree that there's a bad state out there and we need to band together. Belgium, until 1940, they told the French and the British, we don't want anything to do with an alliance. We don't want to provoke Germany. Well, guess what? Belgium, it didn't matter in 1940 when the Wehrmacht invaded your country and had to use the country as a way to get to France. Belgium wasn't particularly an aggressor. It just happened to be geographically in the way. And so I think geography is vital to remember at these times.
Yes, that's, and you mentioned the word isolated. Give us a difference between strategic autonomy and being isolated.
Well, I think it all happens in the worst of times. If your country is at peace, you are strategically autonomous. However, if you are threatened or coerced militarily by another country and no one stands up to you, then I can say you're isolated. And it's a matter of perception and a matter of relativity in relationship to what is happening to that state.
Okay, and could you give us what there is sort of moving into place, if that's the right word at the moment, in the form of, say, the Quad and the Australia, UK, US submarine deal? These are the beginnings of things. What are they, and what does America want?
So broadly speaking, the US alliance system in the post-war period was bilateral, US Tokyo, US Seoul. But we saw after the Cold War period this kind of joining up of structures into trilaterals and minilaterals like the ones you just mentioned. Broadly, it is because some states have a growing threat perception, the Chinese modern militarization, its defense budget increasing incredibly. Its capabilities are, superb compared to what it was 30 years ago. And its appetite for the neighboring countries' territory is pretty large in terms of maritime islands, et cetera, and maritime space. So gradually we've been seeing things like the Quad, where India, which is normally non-aligned and tries to keep to the middle of the road, also worried about that trend line of China being more acquisitive towards maritime sea lanes and trying to control them. And so it's put aside some of that reluctance to align too closely with the US and worked with other regional powers like Japan and Australia. And so none of these are alliances. There's no Article 5 or agreement to defend each other, but they are a very intense level of military cooperation and strategic outlook. Now, recently the Quad, and I'll end on this because I know I'm talking too much, but the Quad has become more geopolitical. So there's less military emphasis and more emphasis on providing infrastructure goods that provide alternatives to China's Belt and Road, and trying to improve connectivity across, economic connectivity across the region. Shall we say, not all roads will lead to Beijing. So there are different things that these groups can do that don't have to be purely military.
Right. And before we move to South Asia, Prashant Kumar has a question here that you've addressed, but I want you to address it head on. Even if it were possible, might an Asian NATO bring about less stability, not more, because it could antagonize China? You touched on that historically, touch on it now.
So the Quad, there's a living proof that this is not the case. The Quad existed before in 2007 and 8. And during that period, they did some cooperation, but China was very antagonistic towards it. So the Quad broke up, and then it didn't revive until 2017. So from 2008 to 2017, we would expect less provocation from China, less antagonism. Actually, the reverse is true. China spent all those years trying to secure the South China Sea, pushing the Philippines, and even building military islands in the South China Sea. So we can see even from proof that when the Quad didn't exist, China was more opportunistic and more threatening rather than less.
Okay, and I think we should throw in for thought. This is not a question to you, John, but of course the accusation is from Moscow certainly and others that because NATO was there and because it was expansionist, that did provoke Ukraine and other things happening. But before we address these bigger issues, our next panelist, we go to South Asia, Dr. Chietigi Bajpai, Senior Research Fellow for South Asia, the Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House. He's worked with top think tanks around the world, and among his many writings is his book, China in India's Post-Cold War Engagement with Southeast Asia. And in many ways, India represents the region's shades of grey when it comes to security alliances. Chietigi Bajpai, how could a NATO in Asia possibly work? And if not that, what?
Thank you, Humphrey, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this forum. It's a real pleasure to be sharing this platform with Humphrey Hawksley. I should mention that I read your works of books of fiction many years ago, and it actually inspired me to shift my career path from
Oh,
finance
God.
to international relations. So I have you to thank for being here today. But so yeah, I've been focusing on India and actually building on the previous speaker's remarks on the Quad, which is often could be regarded as perhaps the most viable candidate for an Asian NATO. This is, of course, the grouping of Asia's four major maritime democracies. They're going to be holding a Quad foreign ministers meeting tomorrow, and later this year there'll be a summit meeting. India will be hosting the Quad summit for the first time this year. The Quad, I think, remains an important initiative for India. India's commitment to the forum got a boost following border clashes with China in 2020. And I think this made New Delhi less apprehensive about participating in initiatives that it previously saw as offending Beijing. As I said, India will be hosting the Quad Summit for the first time later this year when President Trump is scheduled to visit India. That being said, I think India maintains an aversion to any initiative that resembles a military alliance. It's the only member of the Quad that doesn't have a formal alliance relationship with any of the other states, although it has concluded agreements with these countries in improving defense technology collaboration, interoperability with their militaries. But it's apprehensive of any effort to try and push the Quad or any other initiative that it is part of in the direction of a formal military alliance. It also maintains a long-standing commitment to strategic autonomy in its foreign policy, which essentially means engaging all major poles of influence in the international system, and that includes countries with which the West has a history of difficult relations. So it would include Iran, Russia, and also to some degree China. So I think for the foreseeable future, India has chosen to throw its weight behind the West. We can see that with ongoing free trade negotiations recently concluded with the UK, ongoing negotiations with the US and EU, collaboration in the tech space, in the defense and security space. India wants to project this more benign worldview, which is non-Western but not explicitly anti-Western. And as a result, it appears, I think, more at home in forums like the Quad than it does in other initiatives, like, say, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which promotes a more overtly anti-Western agenda. But frankly, I think the future is uncertain. I mean, it's important to note that one of the reasons why the first iteration of the Quad, which emerged in 2007, one of the reasons it failed was because India was apprehensive about the initiative. India, of course, has its own problems with China, as noted by the border tensions that we saw in 2020, but it doesn't want to get dragged into any US-China conflict over Taiwan, for example. India has never participated in any US-led freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Strait. So I think while initiatives like the Quad will continue to go stronger, you'll see closer alignment, but not an alliance. And hence, I think I'm somewhat skeptical about the emergence of a so-called Asian NATO, which would entail some sort of collective security arrangement. I mean, just looking at recent developments over the last couple of months, or over the last week for that matter, the U.S. commitment to NATO is somewhat wobbly. So, what hope is there for replicating something similar to that in the Indo-Pacific region? But let me stop there. Obviously, happy to answer any questions.
Various groups. I just wondered if we could talk, because there's the BRICS, there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, other things like that, and there's the Quad. Just line up for us these various organizations, because India, in a way, sits in the middle, doesn't it? For example, last year, I think it was, Prime Minister Modi chose to go to the BRICS meeting over the Commonwealth meeting, which wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. How is that shifting?
So, as I said, I think India has this ambition to be a leader, or what it refers to as a voice of the global South. It wants to play this role of a bridging power between the West and the rest, and as I said, present a more benign worldview, which is non-Western but not explicitly anti-Western. So it's part of these non-Western initiatives like the BRICS, for instance. It's part of the SCO. At the same time, it's of course part of the G20. It's part of the Quad. So I think it's trying to, if we want to call it, bake its cake and eat it as well. But I think that's easier said than done. particularly with initiatives which promote this sort of overtly anti-Western agenda. So the SCO in particular, I think that is where it's going to increasingly struggle. Prime Minister or the Foreign External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, he made a speech earlier this year in which he stated very bluntly that he said, look at the countries with which India is conducting free trade negotiations. They're the UK, they're the US, they're the EU. These are our key technology, strategic, innovation partners. So I think India is clearly leaning in the direction of the West, but it does want to maintain that role as a sort of a voice or a leader of the global South.
But sometime if we go 10 or 20 years ahead, at some stage, India is going to have to make some sort of arrangement, alliance, acceptance, whatever you want to call it, with China. It can't be pulled, or can it be pulled into an constantly antagonistic relationship with it? And I'll be asking the same about Japan later on. But is there thinking in India that they've actually got to make their peace with China in some way, or not?
Well, I think we've already seen that to some degree. We saw a border agreement that was concluded last October, which essentially sought to de-escalate tensions between both countries. This came just before the BRICS summit, and subsequent to that, we've seen the resumption of political dialogue, the special representatives framework, efforts to resume what they call people-centric interactions, so whether it be direct flights, a Hindu pilgrimage which goes to China, the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra. So I think there is a recognition in India that the fact is that China remains a leading trade partner, and in areas from pharmaceuticals to solar panels, India maintains a heavy dependence on components and raw materials that are being sourced from China. So it cannot remove that dependence despite the difficult political or security relationship that it has with China.
And does that recognition contradict what America wants from India?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think all countries recognize that to a certain degree. I think perhaps the U.S. is perhaps on a different wavelength. I think the U.S. is attempting to maintain primacy vis-a-vis China. I think all other countries, and I would include a lot of the United States, European allies and partners, and Japan and other countries, they're not seeking to maintain primacy necessarily vis-a-vis China, but maintain resilience, supply chain resilience. So they're not, putting all their eggs in one basket, not being overly exposed or overly dependent on China. So in that context, I would say, if anybody, it's the U.S. which is the odd man out, not India. I think India's sort of viewpoint is more in line with a lot of other countries, including U.S. allies and partners.
I've just got to pick you up before I let you go. You said the US is the odd man out. Is it increasingly becoming the odd man out in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I mean, as we've heard, I mean, the fact that only 3 of the 4 AP4 countries did not show up to the NATO summit last week. The fact that to some degree, I would say that the U.S. has, I wouldn't say alienated, but its relations with 3 of the other Quad member states has been difficult, to say the least. Its relations with India have been somewhat strained over the recent India-Pakistan tensions and the position taken by the U.S. Its relations with Australia have also been somewhat strained in the context of its recent statements that it's made about AUKUS, and also with Japan, where it's put pressure on Tokyo to increase defense spending. So I think, yeah, in that context, one could argue it's the U.S. which is increasingly the odd man out in terms of its perception of the emerging global order, the regional architecture in the regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Stay with us whilst we move on to our next speaker, because we're going from talking about a massive country to a small country to Singapore, that beating heart of neutrality, if that's what it is, whose founding father Lee Kuan Yew forged the concept of Asian values as opposed to Western ones. Our panelist, Giri Rajendran, lives on the front line of trade and investment. The money that is the lifeblood of the region. He's worked as an economist in transatlantic defense before moving to finance, first in private wealth management, and then onto asset management, most recently at BlackRock. How does Southeast Asia view an Asian NATO, polarizing or protective? Giri Rajendran, give us your argument.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, and a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. To answer this question about Asian NATO, I would sort of pose 3 questions as a sort of criteria that I would have to assess its viability. The first would be whether or not there is non-interference in the internal affairs of neighboring states of the states of the alliance. And the reason I would set this up is if you look back in history at something like the Baghdad Pact back in 1955 in the Middle East, the reason that never got off the ground was partly because there wasn't sufficient trust within the member states that would have formed part of an alliance. The second question would be, is there local buy-in? And I think we've already heard in the cases of India and Indonesia about how states prioritize strategic autonomy as well as collaborative engagement rather than collective defense. And so at this stage, I would suggest that there isn't a huge amount of local buy-in, given the blowback in economic terms that states might suffer, particularly vis-a-vis China, should they join such a grouping. And then the third question would be, would it meaningfully increase deterrence? Is the whole more than the sum of the parts? And this is the piece that I'd like to sort of speak a little bit more about in this session. And the answer I would come to is possibly not. The reason I would say this is the acid test for a meaningful Asian NATO would, I imagine, be as an effective deterrent against the Chinese attack on Taiwan or the Philippines. And I would look at this question of deterrence like an economist. What is the marginal increment of deterrence produced by an Asian NATO, and is it worth the cost? So if you look at it from a capability perspective, I would argue that's an important way to look at it, simply because the Indo-Pacific is a very different theater from Europe or even the Middle East. The distances are truly vast. It's on a hemispheric scale. Sea lines of communication run these vast distances, and very specific capabilities in terms of range and refueling are required just in order to get to the fight, let alone to sustain operations in a high tempo under contested missile saturated conditions. And so in reality, there are only a few states that are able to generate the capability needed to contribute meaningfully to an Asian NATO that aims to deter in a Taiwanese or Philippine sort of contingency. And so it's quite an unequal place. And in my view, there are only really two states at the moment who are really suited for expeditionary island or archipelagic defense with technological sophistication at scale, and that's the United States and Japan. These are the states that matter most. And so let me sort of run you some numbers to support this perspective. And these are from the latest military balance from the IISS. So Japan, I think, you could argue, has the strongest navy in Asia outside China, 45,000 soldiers, 25 attack submarines, and 54 principal service combatants. That includes 34 destroyers, 4 carriers, 4 Aegis naval cruisers. You complement this with 66 maritime patrol aircraft and 81 anti-submarine warfare helicopters. So a really sizable contribution in the naval and maritime domain. On top of this, strategic enablers, 22 airborne early warning control aircraft, 11 tanker transport, and 53 strategic lift assets. So my point is that this is a military that is oriented towards expeditionary air-sea concepts of operation, able to power project, undertaking high-intensity operations. Let me just contrast that with Australia, which is also a major contributor to, who would be a major contributor to an Asian NATO. That navy is about a third the size. So about 15,000 sailors, about a third the size of the Japanese Air Force, about 15,000 airmen. It brings to the table at the moment just 6 attack submarines, which are diesel electric, so they have limited submerged range. On top of that, you have 10 principal service combatants, 7 of which are aging Anzac-class frigates. So even, at the top end of the capability spectrum within the region, you see a very sharp drop-off after you consider the top few countries. And so for this reason, I would suggest that on this question of whether or not the sum would be, the whole would be more than the sum of the parts, my suggestion is possibly not, simply because of the great disparity in capability that exists in the region at the moment. So that would be my take. At the moment, it looks a little bit more like a pipe dream than a reality.
Okay, pipe dream reality, and when they're talking about increasing to 5% in Europe, you're saying that wouldn't actually work so well. Where do you're in Singapore? Where do you go with John Hemmings's point about isolation or strategic ambiguity? Is Singapore isolated, or is it strategic autonomy? Sorry.
I think the reality is that small states often don't have the luxury of principles, and you have to hedge. And I think that's what most states in the region will do. I think when you look at what the Trump administration is doing at the moment, and I think you could argue they're moving the world away from a multilateral alliance model to a more of a membership model. What it's trying to do is essentially put economic pressure on countries through its tariffs, etc. And I think the ultimate end goal of that will be actually to exert economic pressure on China, to use the alliance structure that it has militarily to throw that into the economic domain. And so my view is, as long as states in the region have very close economic links to China, they have too much to lose on the downside that they would be losing out on if they decided to sort of band together in a sort of military alliance like this. And so I think the first stage of any process that looks to isolate China international system will start with the economic. And as that rolls on, then you could see, depending on how China reacts, as the downside of forming a part of an alliance goes less and less, you might see more appetite for it.
So if say an economic alliance is a priority over a military alliance, then ASEAN is the organization to grow that through.
Yes, but I think, as someone said earlier, geography matters, and great powers will do what they will. And so you may not have the luxury of simply relying on the economic backstop. You might have, at some point, have to take a side. That moment is not now, but it could occur. And I think initially it will occur in the economic domain, and in future that could have spillover effects into the military.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We are now going to go to Washington and a little bit to Japan to move our debate on. Shihoko Goto, Senior Fellow at the Mansfield Foundation and a member of the US-Japan Network for the Future. Until recently, she was director of the Indo-Pacific program at the Wilson Center. Her specialism is trade and economic interests across the Indo-Pacific and on geopolitical developments in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And from your perspective, Shihoko Goto, tell us what you know.
Yeah, so I'd like to take a step back and ask, why are we talking about an Asian NATO at this point in time? And we have to bear in mind that the United States has been at the heart of regional defense. And of the 7 formal mutual defense treaties that the United States has, 5 are based in the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, there's increasing concern. We've already talked about this at great length during this panel about relying so heavily on the United States as a security guarantor. And without that, the regional stability and growth prospects, as well as security concerns, are at stake. The question, of course, is, are those concerns enough to bring a disparate region together? Are there shared interests? Is there shared interest to boost security that could lead to a collective defense mechanism? And as Ambassador Parkaya and others said, the unity within the Indo-Pacific is not as strong, mostly because there is a different threat perception about China. Because let's face it, China is already the regional hegemon. It is the biggest country geographically. It is the second biggest economy in the world, and it is the biggest military force in the region as well. So from an Indo-Pacific perspective, regardless of where that country may be on the income level or from a governance relationship, they cannot afford to decouple from China. And how to de-risk from China is divergent between Southeast and Northeast Asia. And the debate really, when we talk about the possibility of an Asian NATO or indeed collective defense mechanisms, is about how do we want to have managed relations with China and what would that look like? And I should point out that the Europeans also have this dilemma, and they too are reluctant to antagonize China. So giving you a specific example of this, in 2023, there was talk about posting a NATO regional office in Tokyo. And this was simply to have an office, maybe with a couple of people headquartered in the Japanese capital to do some information sharing and coordination. And the Japanese government was prepared to move forward with this. But there was a great deal of pushback, especially from France, And that was, so the idea was put on hold. And at the latest NATO summit meeting, the idea has essentially become dead. And staying on regarding Japan, what was interesting is that the current Japanese Prime Minister, Ishiba, when he was running, campaigning to become the Prime Minister, he launched this idea of Japan being at the forefront of promoting an Asian NATO in September 2024. The regional response was lukewarm at best. There was howls of fury from China. But I should point out, too, that there was considerable opposition within Japan. There is no real appetite, even from Japan, which is the strongest country from a security perspective in the Indo-Pacific at the moment that could counterbalance China. But there is no real appetite for an Asian NATO. And especially when they look at the obligations that an Asian NATO would have, that is to say Article 5, and this idea of collective security, an attack on one is an attack on all. That is something that the Japanese cannot do constitutionally, politically. There's no appetite for it either. What is interesting, though, is that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization itself, actually needs IP4, much more than IP4 needs NATO at the moment. The IP4 have been at the forefront of supporting NATO's efforts to come to the support of Ukraine. What I do want to say, though, is that it's not all doom and gloom. There are already movements towards collective security. We've already talked about the Quad and AUKUS. And I think AUKUS is very interesting because it offers not just defense, but also technological cooperation as well. And some of the speakers have already pointed out that the Quad is not necessarily focused on security, but it does become the foundation for building trust, which is what is very much needed in the region. What I do want to end my thoughts on is to focus on some of the real threats of countries pursuing strategic autonomy in the Indo-Pacific, that there is considerable wariness about extreme measures being taken to ensure that strategic autonomy. In particular, the possibility, the exploration of becoming nuclear powers. In Korea, public opinion is very supportive of South Korea actually becoming a nuclear state. And in Japan, which is the only country in the world that has been attacked not once but twice by nuclear weapons, traditionally it has been very hesitant, or it has actually been a taboo to talk about Japan becoming a nuclear state. But now there are, on the sidelines, discussion about Japan potentially becoming, looking into the possibility of becoming a nuclear power. So there are many risks, but there are also opportunities for coordination as well.
Shihoko Goto, thank you very much. I just want to follow up on your nuclear element there, because we just had the bombing of Iran. Am I right in thinking that should Japan and South Korea choose to do it, they could do it with the turn of a screwdriver practically? So they are far more advanced in that than Iran is. Is that correct?
So from a technology perspective, both countries are able to become nuclear powers. Now, Japan and Korea are at different levels of political acceptance of that. Certainly, the debate in South Korea has been very robust in recent years about South Korea becoming a nuclear power. But at the same time, that risks South Korea being ostracized by the international community. So that's the balance that's going on. In Japan, it's still very much a subject that is not talked about in mainstream political arenas, but in closed door sessions that had actually been completely not a possibility. But in recent years and recent months, there is always the idea has begun to surface, but there is great hesitancy to go in that direction.
And then, very hypothetically speaking, in order to stop China bombing Japan's nuclear weapons program, for example, because that seems to be happening at the moment. But I asked this question about India. At some stage, Japan is going to have to make arrangements to live side by side with China without this threat of hostility going on all the time. Can you see that that's beginning to happen now?
So Japan has been at the forefront of talking about a free and open Indo-Pacific, and it has focused on promoting the rule of law. And that role is something that Japan continues to take very seriously. And what it wants is to, one, ensure that the United States does not abandon the region, that it wants to also continue to work closely with the United States. But at the same time, Japan is becoming more realist on the economic front. We are already seeing frameworks like the CPTPP that have moved forward without the United States. The question now is, can we see security relations that actually do not necessarily include the United States without completely sidelining the United States?
Yeah, that's a very fine balancing act. Can I come back to Ambassador Desra Parkaya? Firstly, what's your views on what you've heard, Ambassador? Does this tie in with your thoughts, or is it pushing back against them?
Not really. I think it is the opposite. I think more or less in our region, especially we call it Asia. I think a number of speakers earlier mentioned it. Asia is diversity and diverse and very complex. It's not easy. It's just very unlikely to simplify it. That in the current situation, and given the complexity and diversity, Asia NATO will be an answer. So I think more or less the discussion is get along and also very much in line with my view.
So the conclusion is coming that it is a NATO as such as a pipe dream, but we've had a number of phrases here that come from Shihoko Goto and yourself: cooperative security, collective defense. And one knows that when these things spin into mainstream media headlines, nobody quite knows what they mean. But how do you see, Ambassador? It's the strengthening of ASEAN that we're talking about, isn't it? More than anything else here?
Indeed. That's why ASEAN has come up with the idea of Indo-Pacific, ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, which is cooperation, which is inclusive, and certain areas of cooperation, of course, including economic, sustainable development goals, and many things. So I think I'm very much in favor of, or even my opinion would say that still that the Asian NATO may remain a pipe dream. I'm very much in line with Ms. Goto's earlier statement. In the very beginning, why do we have this kind of discussion? Because the answer is very obvious.
Yes. I think it's because we've seen a talk here in Britain, mainly in the Western capitals, about some form of security or defense against China to balance China in the Indo-Pacific. John Hemmings, could I bring you back in on this thing that we've been hearing? If India and Japan gradually forge new relations with China, how irrelevant or how much pushback would there be in Washington against that?
Well, I mean, there's been obviously many attempts to reset relations with China. I think one of our other panelists mentioned, are we defending U.S. primacy? And I think it's important to note that obviously the Americans think of one thing, but the region thinks of others. And to me, the real question is ASEAN member state sovereignty. We can be inclusive as we want, and I mean no disrespect to the ambassador, because I also believe in the principles of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. But if we're unable to defend the sovereign national interests of our member states, then do we open our minds up to different structures? Again, with all due respect, that you avoid getting drawn into the geopolitical great power machinations, and respect and understand that. But I think, Vietnam was also not mentioned there. And the reason this has become an issue is Shihoko Goto said, is that, we're in a place where regional security is really deteriorated. And this is not like security is getting better and everyone's fine. The reason we're even discussing it is because where I was at my regional center, year after year, we would poll all of our fellows from the region, and year after year, they say it's getting worse. And so that's something to consider.
So this is the view very much from Washington, is it? I mean, that there is a threat there. The threat is led by China, and there is not yet a unified front to stop it.
I think that yes, both things. On the one hand, we worry about regional security and access of our allies and partners. On the other hand, I think that the idea that we are defending our primacy is also probably correct. I mean, no American policymaker would admit that, but broadly, I think that is, we have both of those things in mind. But our allies don't have to. I think they just need to figure out ways to defend their own sovereignty.
Yes, and of course in Europe we have a sort of clear and present enemy, as it were, which isn't quite the same. Chietigi Bajpai, do you agree with John Hemmings?
Yes, actually I do. I mean, I think there are two types of regional organizations in Asia. You have the mini-lateral forums like the Quad, AUKUS, and I think these have become the direction of travel for the regional architecture in Asia. The groupings of like-minded states with a commitment to upholding the rules-based international order, working together on shared concerns, so whether it be climate, pandemic response, supply chain resilience, and these contrast with the more open and inclusive forums that are under the ASEAN framework, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum. Frankly, I think there's a space for both, but as we see growing frictions between major powers, most notably the US and China, but also you can include Russia, I think it's harder to reach a consensus in these more open and inclusive forums. And that's what's raised the value of these mini-lateral organizations to facilitate more issue-based cooperation.
Yeah. And Giri Rajendran, just coming back to you with your economist money hat on, as it were, if this Asian NATO concept gathered force under whatever things, what's that going to do with sort of the concept of trade, supply chains, the sort of breathing blood of Southeast Asia or Asia itself?
I think I would take it in the opposite direction. I think what's happening at the moment, what the Trump administration is doing with tariffs, etc., is what we're seeing is actually a fight over global consumer demand. There's very little global consumer demand in the international system, and it's mainly in the United States. And this is partly because of the rules-based international order. The way it's structured is that many of US allied states have run perpetual surpluses that's led to what's called global imbalances. And what this has meant is that global demand has now become increasingly concentrated in the United States. There's insufficient consumer demand in Europe. There's now very, very poor levels of consumer demand in China. And what's going to happen, what this trade war is doing is leveraging that fact. And it's going to radiate instability from the United States all the way around the rest of the world economically, which is going to have a chilling effect on global growth, as well as a chilling effect on global trade, simply because there isn't enough global, consumer demand in the system. What I think will happen then is that the reliance of states on China will decrease, because it's not a source of demand. You cannot replace US demand with Chinese demand, because that's not how they run their economy. And as the economic reliance on China decreases, then you can have the trade space to try to look at things from the military side of things. So, and I'm not saying this is going to happen in 1 or 2 years. I think this is a 5-year process before this reality starts to come into being, and we'll see at that point what things look like. So I don't think it's the military that's going to impact the economic. I think it's the economic that's going to impact the military alliance structures.
Thank you for that. I would like to go around the rest of the panel now to see whether they agree or disagree with you. That is, increase reliance on China or decrease reliance on China, because I think the panel has agreed more or less that a NATO as such is a pipe dream, but what if not? Let us go around again. Shihoko Goto, more or less reliance on China?
Let me answer by posing a different question.
Thank you.
I think the biggest challenge right now is trust or lack thereof. There is no trust. There's diminishing trust about the United States. There's also diminishing trust about what the shared interest is in envisioning a relationship with China as well. So once we are able to build up that trust, then we can start talking about what kind of partnerships and relationships we have.
Chietigi Bajpai, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think frankly, in the case of India, I think over the short to medium term, the reliance on China will increase, not decrease. So there's been this false narrative of this idea of India as a beneficiary of the push to de-risk or diversify supply chains away from China, a beneficiary of some sort of China +1 strategy. But the reality, India's contribution to global manufacturing is less than 10% of that of China's. So that dependence is going to remain. As India becomes more central to global supply chains, it's going to actually become more, not less dependent on China. In terms of, the future, I think frankly, we're going to see, rather than seeing some sort of Asian NATO, we're probably going to see a spaghetti bowl or a noodle bowl, if you want to call that, of several initiatives forming part of this, wider security network for the region. And this will comprise initiatives like the Quad, AUKUS, potentially the Squad, even GCAP we didn't talk about, comprising Japan, UK, and the Italy, working on 6th generation fighter aircraft. And I think that is probably the direction of travel. It'll be a bit more messy than what we see, say, in Europe in some sort of unified collective security organization under the framework of NATO.
A noodle bowl of collective security. I like that. John Hemmings, your final thoughts.
Just, I think that as powers in the region think about security architectures, not to discount the alliance, don't overthink NATO. That's a too Western, too institutional term. And, use the Americans' interest and prioritization of the region to defend your interests rather than American interests. And I think you'll do what many US allies do anyway.
Thank you. And Ambassador Parkaya, could I throw a different question to you to sum up our debate, because you and I are in London. The Europeans and Britain, should we stay out of the Indo-Pacific and concentrate here in Europe, or should we deploy further into the Indo-Pacific?
I answer with the question, does UK has enough resources to be more active in the region? They don't, to be honest. And this has been my message to the colleague at the UK here, FCDO. Do not always look our region from the prism of China. Do not only look in the context of political security, but also economic development. That's my message to the UK government.
Thank you very much. That's a very good message, and thank you all for summing up so beautifully and with great imagination with the spaghetti and noodles. But time is up, unfortunately. Thank you, Ambassador Desra Parkaya, John Hemmings, Chietigi Bajpai, Giri Rajendran, and Shihoko Goto, and thank you to our audience for your questions that kept us on our toes. Our next Democracy Forum debate is July the 15th, but given the fluidity of global issues, we are deciding on that topic in the next few days. But join us then from wherever you are in the world. And until then, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you.
The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organization founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists, and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.